Hey everyone! So, for the math and science activity that we completed 2 weeks ago, I chose to create a lesson plan involving shapes. So, the main purpose behind this lesson was to get students to know certain shapes, but not only be able to point out, like, this is a square, this is a rectangle, but to know why this is a square, why this is a rectangle, and to be able to um, tell others why that shape is different and unique from the other shapes. So to begin, I chose to use the math standard correctly named shapes regardless of their orientation and overall size. So that's a kindergarten math standard, but this lesson is really geared for students who are age 3 to 5. So as I was working with my lesson, I noticed that for 3-year-olds, this would be something new for them. Like they would actually be gaining knowledge from it. And then sometimes for older kids, they might already know these shapes. And so it might be a review for them, but you could also extend it and to have them do different shapes, but also really focus on knowing the attributes of the shapes and not just knowing the shapes. So for the objectives, students will identify shapes such as squares, circles, rectangles, and triangles. And then they'll also, one of my objectives was for them to color inside the lines with the correct color that they were supposed to be using. So for this lesson, it requires very little materials. So I created a worksheet for them, and I also had shape manipulatives, and then of course crayons and pencils. So to begin, I said that this lesson should be done in centers, hopefully with groups of 3 or 4, so that you could really have that one-on-one time with the students, but also group interaction. So to begin, the teacher would have the manipulatives out on the table with the students. And so for this particular lesson, I chose to focus on squares, circles, rectangles, and triangles. So each of the manipulatives would be a different color. So for example, the teacher would have them laid out, and she would just start off the lesson by asking questions, describing a shape. So for example, for the square, she could say, which one of these shapes has 4 sides and 4 corners? But not just 4 sides and 4 corners. Which one of these shapes has 4 sides, 4 corners, and all the sides are the same length? And so then the students would have to look and figure out which shape she's describing. And then if they had trouble, she could say, this shape is green if it was green, or blue if it was blue. And so the students would guess which shape the teacher was describing, and then the teacher would go on to do that for all 4 shapes. So for the triangle, she would say, which shape has 3 sides and 3 corners? And then the students would guess a triangle. Same with the circle, which shape has no sides, which shape has no corners? And in the rectangle, you could say which shape has 4 sides, 4 corners, but 2 of the sides are longer than the others, or however you chose to go about explaining that. And so through this activity, you could also go into a discussion of, well, what is a side and what is a corner? And you could have the students figure out that a side is the straight part of the shape, and a corner is where 2 sides meet. And so my child that I worked with, actually, she called it a point. And she made a reference to ballet and point, and how the shapes that had pointy edges did ballet, and the shapes that didn't have pointy edges didn't like ballet, because point is a form of ballet. I thought that was very funny and unique, and is a way to relate it to children who like dance. So anyway, going on to the next activity. So after you have the initial, like, what is a shape? What do they look like? And what makes it different from the others? Lead them into an I Spy game. And so this was very fun for me to do with the student I worked with. So I began and I said, okay, we're going to play a game of I Spy. Pretty much all students know what I Spy is, but if they don't, you can explain it to them. And so I just looked around the room, and for example, I used their cubbies. I said, I spy a square. So they have to know what a square is to know what they're looking for. And then I went to describe what color it was. It was blue. I spy a blue square. And then there weren't many blue squares, but I went in to say it holds your stuff, or I can't remember exactly what I said, but she guessed the cubby. And so then I was like, hey, well, it's your turn. You have to choose one of these 4 shapes, find it around the room, and you can play that game with me. And so she actually used the rug and said, I spy a rectangle, and then said it was very colorful. And so went in to say that that was the rug. And although I just did this lesson with one student, I think that the I Spy game would be really, really, really fun with a group of 3 or 4, because they could be competitive and they could each get a turn. And whoever spotted it first could be the next person that got to choose, that got to be it for the game. And so hopefully my intention behind this game was to have something that the students could do like while they're just playing. So hopefully some things that you do as a lesson will turn into like a game that they can play on an everyday basis. So my intention was that, oh, well, they could do this with other shapes, or they might do this with colors, or something that can just get their brains going and remembering what was taught and like what knowledge they had gained. And so lastly, for like the formal assessment was the worksheet, the shapes worksheet that I created. And so basically on the shapes worksheet, it had 2 or 3 of each shape, and they were all different sizes, and the directions had you to color specific shapes, a specific color. So for example, mine said color all squares green, and all the circles red, rectangles yellow, triangles blue. And so they had to know that, for example, the squares and rectangles can be confusing for students. So they had to know that a rectangle has longer sides, and so therefore they would color the rectangle yellow and not green like a square. And so that was my formal assessment, although there was informal assessments going on throughout the lesson. My student did that worksheet phenomenal. She loved it. And something that I thought could be more of an enrichment activity for this lesson would be have them draw the shapes. And, you know, they wouldn't be perfect, but at least they would get practice in doing it, drawing a circle, drawing a rectangle, drawing a square. And so I think for your more advanced kids, that would be a great idea, is to have them physically draw it instead of color inside the lines. I also think something that could be an enrichment for these students would be to add more challenging shapes. So these are pretty much the basic shapes that students begin to learn. But you could add in an oval. You could add in, why is an oval different from a circle? You could add in a pentagon, a hexagon, octagon, and all of those. So I think that would be a challenge for some students who for this lesson would be a review for. If you added in more shapes, they would be gaining knowledge as well. And so for intervention, I said we could have a shape chart for the worksheet. So if the student didn't know what a square was, maybe have a visual. Square is this is what a square looks like. This is what a rectangle looks like. And then for accommodations, depending on the level of the child or the need of the child, the teacher could just work with them. So, thanks.